I am the co-director of the Murphy Institute, the Terence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy at the University of St. Thomas. The Murphy Institute is a joint program between the Law School and the Center for Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas, whose mission is to explore the intersection of Catholic thought, law, and public policy. We are very pleased tonight to welcome William Cavanaugh from DePaul University. I will not be introducing Professor Cavanaugh. Rather, I just want to sort of advertise three events that are upcoming. First of all, on March 3rd, the Department of Catholic Studies will be hosting Dr. Edward Peters, the canon lawyer, who will be speaking on the Synod of Bishops and the New Evangelization, and that will be advertised at the university website and the website of the Department for Catholic Studies. Then in March, I want to encourage you to attend the Conversations in Feminism, Law, and Religion conference, which is being held here at the University of St. Thomas, the St. Paul campus, co-sponsored by a variety of other institutes and centers on campus, and featuring the work of my co-director, Lisa Schultz, and some of her collaborators who have worked on questions regarding feminism, law, and religion. And then finally, in late April, we are hosting a conference on business as an agent for social change, social entrepreneurship, benefit corporations, and curing poverty. And there's more information to be found about all of these events and others on our website, which is you should be able to easily find. And we also have pamphlets and other such things outside. So let me now introduce Michael Hollerich, Professor of Theology at the University of St. Thomas, who will be introducing William Cavanaugh. Thank you.
Thanks, Billy. I'm Michael Hollerich from the Department of Theology here, and it's my privilege tonight to introduce Bill Cavanaugh from DePaul University, where he is Director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology and a Professor of Catholic Studies. As you probably know, Bill was for many years a member of St. Thomas's Theology Department until he left us in 2010 for Chicago and its only slightly milder climate. He and his family have come back often since then, but always, he says, in the summer, when they say to one another, "Why did we ever leave such a beautiful place?" Now he's back in February, and this February in particular, to refresh the memories of the rest of the year. Here at St. Thomas, Bill was a deeply valued colleague and a very good friend. For years, his office was next door to mine, and we spent a lot of time talking about theology and politics. For two people with such common backgrounds, it was sometimes surprising to find out how much we disagreed about. But there is no one, I can honestly say, from whom I have learned more about how to think critically about the Church's relationship to the public sphere, as most recently as last night. Except for Mondays in the fall, when there was always a football game from the previous Saturday to talk about. To get up to speed on what he has been doing since he left here, I asked Bill for a copy of his CV. Reading this is not an exercise for the faint of heart, but it tells you why DePaul is so lucky to have him. I count 5 separate books, 2 edited volumes, 37 academic articles, almost 40 chapters in edited volumes, and dozens of reviews, shorter articles, and lectures and presentations before academic and church audiences all over the globe, from Sweden to Australia, and from the Philippines to Chickasha, Oklahoma. That was just last month, but even that wasn't his most recent talk. As of a week ago Monday, he was in Milwaukee, where he spoke twice in the same day. Bill is known for his work on many aspects of the intersection between theology and politics, but above all, for his insistence that the secularization of the modern state, whether in its liberal or its totalitarian form, has been nothing of the sort. In his telling, the modern state has for several centuries now been borrowing from the sphere of the supposedly departed sacred to legitimate its own insatiable, totalizing demands, putting on sacred vestments, if you will, and what amounts to a type of religious cross-dressing, a metaphor that I will not pin on him, but is my invention. This is clear from the title of his most recent book, Migrations of the Holy, Theologies of State and Church, published by Urbans in 2011. Tonight, he will be speaking on religious freedom and the security state. Would you please join me in welcoming Bill Cavanaugh back to St. Thomas? I forgot to mention that we will have time for questions afterwards, and I will field them from the audience after Bill is done.
Thanks, Mike, for that generous introduction. Mike was one of my best friends and one of the reasons it was hard to leave St. Thomas, and I keep running into reasons why it was hard to leave St. Thomas just since I've been back last night. I loved it here and loved the Twin Cities. I moved south for warmer climes. You know, the palm trees were swaying in the breeze as I left Chicago yesterday. But it's always wonderful to be back here. Next time, maybe invite me in May or something like that instead of February. But it's really delightful to be back. In October of 2005, Stephen Kobasa, a teacher with 25 years of service in Catholic schools, was fired from Colby Cathedral High School in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he had taught for 6 years. He was fired for refusing to display the American flag permanently in his classroom. He didn't ask his students to accept his position, but he explained to them what he felt his Catholic faith required of him. And just before he was fired, Kobasa wrote a letter to the Bishop of Bridgeport explaining that to display the flag, quote, would be an act against my conscience as a believing Roman Catholic Christian. My teaching can never take its legitimacy from any symbol except the cross of Christ. To elevate any national emblem to that level would be for me to ignore the fundamental call of Jesus to compassion without boundaries. Kobasa added that the threat of dismissal being leveled against him, quote, creates the unmistakable impression that national loyalty is being valued over faithful obedience to the gospel, end quote. And after he was fired, Kobasa said, everything in the gospel rejects what flags stand for: boundaries, hatreds, creation of enemies. For a Catholic Christian school that holds up the crucifix as a symbol of God's love, the flag can only be a contradiction. The church can only function with its prophetic voice by standing outside the state, end quote. Now, the irony of this happening at a school named after St. Maximilian Kolbe was apparently lost on those in charge. Kolbe, of course, was a Franciscan priest who gave himself to be starved to death at Auschwitz in place of another man, a simultaneous act of obedience to God and defiance of National Socialism. Now, what the bishop had in mind in firing a faithful Catholic man with a family to support in the middle of the semester was never made public. Kobasa himself never received a reply to his letter asking for the bishop's reasons. All inquiries after the fact were directed to a statement on the diocese website which read, quote, the Diocese of Bridgeport has long believed that the American flag is an important fixture in its Catholic school classrooms, end quote, without ever giving any indication as to why. Now, the bishop who fired Stephen Kobasa was William Lori. That name might be familiar to you. Lori is now the Archbishop of Baltimore and the man in charge of the bishop's campaign for religious freedom. Archbishop Lori chairs the bishop's Committee on Religious Liberty, so the man now in charge of championing Catholics' freedom of conscience is the one who fired Stephen Kobasa for refusing on gospel grounds to display the American flag. Now, I don't think this ironic state of affairs is simply a biographical quirk about a solitary bishop. Tonight, I will use the bishop's campaign for religious freedom to explore a curious dynamic in the public self-presentation of the Catholic Church in America. There's a frequent oscillation in the bishop's rhetoric between dire apocalyptic statements about the state of American society on the one hand and patriotic, boosterish statements about America on the other. And that's what I want to explore, that oscillation. Both extremes, I'm going to argue, come from a Constantinian habit in American Catholic rhetoric, which assumes that the church should be and is an integral part of the American social order. So tonight I'm going to argue that both extremes should be avoided by taking on a more realistic assessment of the church's place in America, one that emphasizes the Augustinian theme of the homelessness of the church in America as we proceed on pilgrimage to our heavenly home. So my talk will proceed in three parts. I'm first going to discuss some features of the bishop's campaign for religious freedom. Second, I'm going to meditate on the terms religious and freedom in turn and suggest that the confinement of Catholicism to the category of religion is accompanied by an overly sanguine view of the nation-state that ignores the broader threats to freedom that the state poses. I will argue that the church should not feel too much at home in any political order, but should rather conceive of itself as on pilgrimage to its true home. So first part, the bishop's campaign. Much of the public presence of the Catholic Church in the U.S. over the past few years has been marked by the bishop's campaign for religious freedom that was spurred primarily by the Obama administration's health care mandate. The bishops have been criticized for failing to respect the distinction between church teaching and public policy, for being politically motivated by animus for President Obama and the Democratic Party, for overemphasizing a relatively minor issue. None of those are my concern here tonight. I think the bishops are right to be worried about state coercion aimed at forcing Catholic groups and others to violate their own convictions. And in fact, I signed a public ecumenical statement on religious freedom because of those concerns. Nevertheless, I think there are problems with the way the bishop's campaign has been conducted, problems that point to deeper issues about the way that the church has been assimilated into American society. There's a clear sense among the bishops that the church is under attack from forces of secularization in American society, both from, as Archbishop Laurie says, quote, governmental authority that slices and dices our church, end quote, and from broader hostility that would, quote, diminish the influence of religion in helping to shape the character of our country, end quote. Now, I think one must admit that the bishops have not always been very good at acknowledging their own responsibility for generating hostility to the church. Cardinal George, his oft-quoted quip that his successor will die in prison and his successor's successor will die a martyr, expresses the sense that the United States is increasingly hostile territory for the church. This type of apocalyptic language about America is nevertheless oddly juxtaposed with patriotic language and images. The bishop's strategy for countering attacks on religious liberty has been centered on appeals to American ideals, especially the liberal ideals of freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, and devotion to America itself. The apocalyptic language seems to come from a sense of shock that people do not recognize that Catholicism should fit neatly into American society. The bishop's campaign, therefore, appeals to the American public to appreciate what religion contributes to America. Archbishop Laurie's opening homily for last year's Fortnight for Freedom was entitled Faith Enriches Public Life, and it ends with a rousing, "May God bless these United States of America." The fit of Catholicism with America is emphasized in two ways. The first is in appeals to the American ideal of freedom of religion, which is generally presented as the freedom of the individual to believe whatever his or her conscience dictates. For example, the bishops quote James Madison to the effect that the religion of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. The second is in the bishop's appeals to American patriotism. The bishop's Religious Liberty at Home webpage shows a Franciscan in full garb brandishing a large American flag, and American flags show up prominently on virtually every page of the website. I'll give you a few examples here. This is the only thing PowerPoint is really good for. Paul Voida just reminded me of the quote, power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. Besides these images, there is also on the Archdiocese of Baltimore, if you go on their website for the Fortnight for Freedom, there's a link to a parish that has what's called a patriotic rosary. And if you click on that link, you're taken to this long format for a patriotic rosary, where each of the 50 beads of the rosary has been translated into one of the 50 states. And there are 5 mysteries of the patriotic rosary. There's hymns, the Battle Hymn of the Republic and Star Spangled Banner and so on. And the 5 mysteries are 5 quotes from George Washington and John Adams and so on. The 5th mystery is worth noting. This, by the way, was just pointed out to me by Mike Hollerick this afternoon. Here's the 5th mystery of the patriotic rosary. And it's by General Robert E. Lee in 1863, and imploring the aid of God to what he calls our cause and our people, and invoking God's aid in the defense of our liberties, one of which, of course, is the right to own black people. I mean, there's something very disturbing about this being part of the campaign. Now, the prayer for the protection of religious liberty, a few more examples, the prayer for protection of religious liberty that was distributed in parishes throughout the country prays that, quote, "This great land will always be one nation, one God, or under God indivisible, with liberty and justice for all," and, quote, "To the lay people, the bishops, quote, exhort them to be both engaged and articulate in insisting that as Catholics and as Americans, we do not have to choose between the two," end quote. In their statement on religious freedom entitled "Our First Most Cherished Liberty," the bishops do recognize the prospect of unjust laws that Catholics must have the courage to disobey, and they also cite Pope Benedict's admonition that the laity should exhibit, quote, "a strong critical sense vis-a-vis the dominant culture in America," end quote. But the document is nevertheless filled with patriotic language about our enlightened republic, the land of the free, the beacon of hope for the world, and so on. The bishop's statement begins, "We are Catholics, we are Americans, we are proud to be both, grateful for the gift of faith which is ours as Christian disciples, and grateful for the gift of liberty which is ours as American citizens. To be Catholic and American should not mean having to choose one over the other," end quote. Now, it's not hard to sympathize with the bishop's attempts to win protection by appealing to the nation's best sense of its own ideals. The problem, I think, is that in minimizing the tension between Catholicism and America, Catholics too easily assume that Catholicism can be fitted into America as the particular into the universal, whereas I think it's the other way around, that the church is the universal, the Catholic. Appeals to the freedom of the individual conscience and appeals to patriotism work together. The way that the church and the nation-state have tended to make their peace in modernity is by assuming that a division of labor obtains in which the Christian's private religious allegiance belongs to God and her public allegiance belongs to the nation. So religious allegiance in a liberal society has increasingly been defined since the mid-20th century as subjective, individual, and essentially apolitical, which is precisely the trivialization of Christian faith that the bishops want to fight. So in what follows, I want to explore this problem by looking more closely first at the term religious and then at the term freedom. So second section, why Catholicism is not a religion. Much of the current debate over religious freedom assumes that the primary contest is over defining freedom, not religion. We assume that we more or less know what we're talking about when we say religion. The argument is about how much freedom religion should be granted. Much of my recent work, though, however, has explored the history of the concept of religion, and I've argued that the designation of Christianity as a religion is one of the means by which the gospel has been marginalized since the creation of the modern state. So I want to suggest that Christianity is not a religion, and therefore the idea of religious freedom granted by the state is problematic. Now, on the face of it, that looks like a ridiculous claim, right? Of course, Christianity is religion. A deeper look at the recent government arguments about the free exercise of religion, however, makes clear that what does and what doesn't get counted as religion is at the heart of the matter, and the distinctions are malleable. The H.H.S. mandate has been framed by its protagonist not as a restriction of religious liberty, but as a clarification about what counts as religion and what does not. So churches, synagogues, mosques, etc., are entitled, as always, to exemption from having to provide insurance coverage for services that violate their principles based on the concept of the free exercise of religion. But schools, hospitals, charities, and other agencies that are affiliated with such congregations have been redefined as not religious, and therefore not exempt from the mandates under the principle of religious freedom, because they do not, quote, serve primarily persons who share their religious tenets, according to the H.H.S. The government's position makes a distinction between church agencies that serve a religious function and those that serve a social function. And the implication, of course, is that religion is not something essentially social. The Justice Department took a similar position in the landmark case Hosanna Tabor versus the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The EEOC argued that the plaintiff in the case, a teacher at a Lutheran school, should not be covered by the ministerial exemption, whereby religious organizations have more freedom to decide who works for them, because the plaintiff taught mostly secular subjects, such as math, social studies, art, etc., along with religion classes. So the government's argument here is, again, makes a sharp distinction between religion and the rest of life, even though the purpose of at least some church-related schools is not simply to tack a little religion onto otherwise secular subjects, but to see all of life through a Christian lens. That's the way it is here at St. Thomas, right? Religion in much American jurisprudence has come to indicate an interiorized set of beliefs in the holding of which the individual conscience may not be violated. At the same time, religion is seen as essentially distinct from secular concerns, such as politics, economics, and social life. That is, everything that happens Monday through Friday, right? Immigration reform, public health policy, etc. Christians may, of course, advocate for one position or another in these public matters based on their own convictions, but those religious convictions are essentially private and pertain to the individual conscience. So Christians who think that the gospel pertains to the whole of life need to ask, as Robert Schettinger puts it, quote, whether the concern so often expressed over the politicization of Islam in the contemporary world ought to be replaced by a concern with the religionization of Christianity, end quote. It's an interesting book called Was Jesus a Muslim? He basically argues that it's not Islam that's odd, it's the religionization of Christianity that's the odd thing, that you would cordon off Christianity from most of what people consider to be life. Now, an argument that can be made that religion need not be understood in such limited terms and was not so understood in American law until the middle of the 20th century. And I think that argument can be made. I'm skeptical of the effectiveness of such arguments for many reasons, one of which is the genealogy of the concept of religion shows that the religious-secular distinction was born precisely in the process of the marginalization of the church as a public presence in the Western world. The religious-secular distinction, as we understand it, was absent from ancient and medieval Christianity. This is not just part of the way the world is. In other words, it's a creation of the modern Western world. Religio, according to Augustine, refers to an attitude of respect and relations between a man and his neighbor, which is something that we would consider to be secular. In the medieval period, there is a religious-secular distinction, but it's the distinction between two different kinds of priests, right? Religious priests are those that belong to an order like the Dominicans, and secular priests are ones who belong to a diocese. In other words, the religious-secular distinction meant nothing like what it means now. There was no cordoning off of religion from the putatively secular aspects of life, no aspect of life to which the gospel was indifferent or God was indifferent. There was indeed a distinction between civil and ecclesiastical authorities, but no corresponding distinction between religion and politics as two separate areas of concern, which I think is precisely why civil and ecclesiastical authorities had so many struggles that were so fierce and interminable from the conversion of Constantine onwards. The first examples in English of the modern religious-secular divide are found in the writings of William Penn and John Locke in the late 17th century. The religion-politics distinction is arguably earlier, but not by much. It takes course in the shape of the 16th and 17th centuries at the precise moment of the birth of the modern state. So to make a very complicated story short and overly simple, the modern concept of religion as something inherently separate from secular pursuits was born in the early modern triumph of civil over ecclesiastical authorities. The direct concern of the church would thenceforth be that area of life designated religion, which would leave politics, business, and other pursuits in the hands of civil rulers who would nevertheless consider themselves to be servants of a Christian order for quite some time. John Locke famously sought to, quote, distinguish exactly the business of civil government from that of religion by defining true religion as the inward and full persuasion of the mind. So religion is brought inward. For Locke, quote, the end of a religious society is the public worship of God, and by means thereof the acquisition of eternal life. All discipline ought therefore to tend to that end, and all ecclesiastical laws to be thereunto confined. Nothing ought or nor can be transacted in this society relating to the possession of civil and worldly goods. So religion has become something shrunken. The confinement that Locke writes about was precisely the basis of religious freedom, not only for Locke, but for the founding fathers who drew on Locke, Madison, Washington, and Jefferson, the very figures the bishops quote in defending religious freedom. Religion is free because it's been confined to the individual conscience. Freedom of religion depends on the definition of religion as a matter of voluntary interior individual belief, such that what one holds to be true in one's heart or between one's ears need have no effect on one's ability to do business with one's neighbor who holds different beliefs. So as Thomas Jefferson famously wrote, it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Great quote. As Ezra Kopelwitz remarks, this distinction between the religious and the secular occurs in societies in which the individual rather than the group. That's going to be key to what I'm arguing. The individual rather than the group is the primary component of social organization. The rise of the individual as the basis of social organization corresponds with the expansion of the centralized modern state with its strong legal rational bureaucracy that treats individuals and not groups as the primary source of social rights, end quote. Now, the point of these remarks is not just archaeological, but it's directly relevant to the contemporary question of religious freedom. The Obama administration's position in issuing the H.H.S. mandate is based on the idea that rights inhere in individuals and not groups. So in this case, individuals have the right to contraception, a right that should be recognized by their employers in providing insurance coverage. Religious groups have no right to deny this right to individuals who work for them, even to individuals who claim membership in the sponsoring church. Because religion is inherently a matter of individual preference, religious bodies cannot claim rights. And this is the logic that is articulated by the New York Times editorial February 10th, 2012, decrying what they called a phony crisis over religious freedom. According to the Times editors, quote, churches are given complete freedom by the Constitution to preach that birth control is immoral, but they have not been given the right to laws that would deprive their followers or employees of the right to disagree with that teaching. If a religious body does not like a public policy that affects its members, it is free to try to change it, but it cannot simply opt out of society or claim a special exemption from the law. The editorial goes on to refer to Catholic hospitals and universities as the church's, quote, non-religious arms. So Catholic universities are non-religious. Since religion is confined to individual belief, the same logic is at play in the Massachusetts federal court decision cited by the bishops, in which the bishop's migration and refugee service was required to provide conception and abortion services or lose its government contract. Individuals have a right to such services, and the church has no right to interfere with that right. Now, this marks then an important shift from into the modern world, the shift from shared substantive conceptions of the good to an individual and formal conception of freedom as the highest good. And that is one of the hallmarks of a liberal society. In his commentary on the New York Times editorial cited above, David Schindler rightly argues, I think, that Catholics make a grave mistake if they approach the current controversy on the assumption that all sides agree in principle about the nature and universality of rights. Liberal conceptions of rights apply to individuals alone, whereas in the Catholic conception, the human person is understood as inherently related to God and to other people. As Schindler comments, if we fail to understand that the present crisis is at root one regarding the nature of the human being, our political strategies, however effective in the short term, will over the long term serve to strengthen the very assumptions that have generated the crisis in the first place. End quote. Liberal conceptions of rights accompanied the debilitation of any intermediate associations like the church that stood between the state and the individual, because they were the only bearers of the shared notions of the good. So as Robert Nisbet argued, the real conflict in modern political history has not been, as is so often stated, between the state and the individual, but between the state and the social group. And I think that's exactly right. So far, the bishops have not articulated a corporate right to freedom. The patristic writers understood human creation in God's image to indicate that all people are created for communion with each other through their communion with God. The image of the body of Christ, so important to the New Testament, ratifies the idea that the church is a corporate personality with a common end and not just a collection of individuals. But the articulation of a right to religious freedom in America is usually done in a way that appeals not to theology, but to putatively secular ideals in principle available to all. The problem is that the dominant secular discourse of rights sees both rights and religious preference as inhering in the individual. And in this light, the bishops appeal to Madison's idea that the religion of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, serves to reinforce the idea that religion is a matter of personal preference, and religious rights apply to individuals and not corporate groups like the church. So the last section then, the land of the free. Reluctance to grant corporate rights to groups like the church is part and parcel of the growth of national identities in the modern era. Devotion to the new nation state was intended to create a larger communal body to which individuals would adhere, which would supersede their loyalties to lesser bodies like the church. John Locke's scheme of toleration famously excluded Catholics, right? The letter on toleration excludes Catholics explicitly, precisely because Catholics in England refused to give over their public allegiance to the king. Catholics refused, in other words, to define themselves as a religion. The United States provided, at least legally, a more friendly environment for the Catholic Church. Catholics were free to worship as they chose, and the United States offered tremendous opportunities for Catholic flourishing. The separation of church and state was, to my mind, essential for the liberation of the Catholic Church from its habit of cooperation with coercive rule. Nevertheless, I will argue that the price of full assimilation to America was higher than the bishops acknowledge. There is another type of Constantinian habit that comes not with the unity of church and state, but with the assumption that the church fits into America as the particular into the universal. In a liberal society with no shared goods, people are free to believe whatever they want to believe. The only thing that unites people is devotion to the nation state itself. And when the nation state itself becomes an end, then freedom is often sacrificed to the end of the security of the nation. And this is, in fact, what I see happening now with the astonishing growth of the American security state, and the bishop's appeals to patriotism, in this sense, I fear, are counterproductive. America, from its inception, was an enlightened and Protestant project, and the waves of Catholic immigrants to the U.S. in the 19th century encountered significant hostility. There were nativist riots. There was anti-Catholic legislation. There was anti-Catholic political parties like the Know-Nothings. Eventually, however, Catholics would settle into America, and one of the main catalysts for Catholic assimilation was war. World War I was a watershed moment. Germans in America stopped speaking German almost overnight. Irish and English and Italians found themselves on the same side of the war. And great propaganda campaigns to whip up support for the American war effort helped create intensified patriotism across ethnic lines. The first national organization of Catholic bishops began in World War I as the National Catholic War Council. This is how the National Council of Catholic Bishops got its start, as the National Catholic War Council, whose purpose was to coordinate Catholic efforts in support of the American war effort. It was chaired by Cardinal George Mundelein of Chicago, and the National Catholic War Council set out to educate Catholics into American patriotism and prove Catholic loyalty to America. As Cardinal Mundelein said, the people of the United States must be American or something else. They cannot serve two masters. He's quoting Jesus here, of course, but for a slightly different purpose. Catholics proved themselves then to be as soldiers in 2 world wars, and millions of immigrants' children took advantage of the GI Bill to become the first in their families to attend college. The FBI and the CIA found Catholic colleges fertile recruiting grounds in the 1950s, as Catholics were eager to prove their fidelity to America. College also provided a way for Catholics to enter the middle class where the American dream waited. And the culmination of this process of assimilation is often said to be when a Catholic was elected president in 1960. The election of John F. Kennedy, of course, was a point of tremendous pride for Catholics in America. The irony, however, is that Kennedy was elected based in part on his promise that his Catholicism would have nothing to do with the way he governed the country. His promise was made in his famous speech to the Houston Ministerial Association 2 months before the election in 1960. The real issues of the campaign, Kennedy began, were war and hunger and communism and not religious issues. So he says he has come to talk about not the kind of church I believe in, for that should be important only to me, but the kind of America I believe in. That America is one where there is full religious freedom and the president's, quote, religious views are his own private affair. Decisions as president, he goes on to say, will not be made using Catholic criteria. Any decision he makes as president will be made, quote, in accordance with what my conscience tells me to be the national interest and without regard to outside religious pressures or dictates, end quote. And Kennedy goes further. His ideal is a country where not only the president but the voters make decisions independent of their faith. A country, quote, where there is no Catholic vote, no anti-Catholic vote, no voting bloc of any kind, end quote. So Kennedy rejects the idea that a Catholic's loyalty is divided between his church and his country. Quote, I do not concede that any conflict to be even remotely possible. And as proof, he offers the ultimate test, that for which a person is willing to kill and die. Quote, this is the kind of America I believe in, and this is the kind I fought for in the South Pacific, and the kind my brother died for in Europe. No one suggested then that we may have a divided loyalty, that we did not believe in liberty, or that we belonged to a disloyal group that threatened the freedoms for which our forefathers died. Now, the church that Kennedy foresaw has largely come to pass. Polling data make clear that the voting patterns of self-identified Catholics don't vary in any significant measure from those of the American population as a whole. Catholics as a whole have become largely indistinguishable from the rest of the population, and Catholics are therefore divided, like all Americans, between Republicans and Democrats, sometimes bitterly. What unites us outside of the limited realm of religion is not our devotion to Jesus Christ, but our devotion to the United States. The Catechism of the Catholic Church warns against both what it calls, quote, the idolatry of the nation and the idolatry of the state. Idolatry is usually a matter of degree, of course. It becomes a problem when a created thing becomes an end in itself to which people and resources are sacrificed. Consider then that the, quote, freedoms for which our forefathers died, to which Kennedy referred, have been eroded by the continual growth of what has been called the national security state in the United States. A Washington Post investigation found 1,271 government agencies and 1,931 private companies contracted by the government working on counterterrorism, homeland security, and intelligence Since 2001, 33 building complexes dedicated to top-secret intelligence work have gone up in Washington, the equivalent of 22 Capitol buildings. There has been approximately $1 trillion in new spending on intelligence over the last decade, in addition to a military budget that already exceeds, by some estimates, those of the rest of the world's nations combined. Government agencies are authorized to have access to private financial records and electronic communications without warrant. The Patriot Act gives the president the power to detain any U.S. citizen without charges indefinitely on suspicion of abetting terrorism. President Obama has claimed the right to assassinate U.S. citizens and has dramatically increased the use of unmanned drone strikes. Of the 2,200 people killed in Pakistan by drones, Human Rights Watch has said that at least 600 were non-combatants. In Yemen, well over half those killed by U.S. drones since 2009 have been civilians, including a pregnant woman and 3 children. Revelations before Congress of U.S. involvement of the torture of tens of thousands of Vietnamese prisoners produced a backlash against torture in the 1970s, but the 9/11 terrorist attacks opened the gates for U.S. participation in torture once again. Vice President Dick Cheney said less than a week after the attacks that the U.S. would need to work on what he said was the dark side. And since 9/11, treatment by U.S. forces, quote, has included harsh beatings, agonizing physical immobilization, suffocation, sensory deprivation, prolonged sleep deprivation, prolonged isolation from all human contact, sexual and other forms of humiliation, anal and vaginal rape, canine attacks, and the experience of drowning induced by waterboarding, end quote. Such treatments have been given cover by official policies coming down from the highest reaches of government. Prisoners have been tortured at U.S. black site secret prisons and handed over to other governments for torture in a program called Extraordinary Rendition. President Obama has refused to prosecute anyone accused of participation in torture under the Bush administration, has refused to release records of U.S. interrogations in Iraq and Afghanistan, has not ended the rendition program, and has not closed Guantanamo Bay despite promising to do so. And meanwhile, the National Security Administration has been conducting a massive spying program on the electronic communications of all Americans. And that's just a brief summary. That was just one paragraph. What are we to make of the rhetoric of American freedoms when freedom in America seems so systematically under assault? One approach would be to see the growth of the security state as an aberration in the history of American freedoms and to call it back to its original foundations. It's possible, however, that the growth of the security state in America, while not inevitable, is not an aberration either. Figures as far back as Hobbes and Hegel have suggested that, in a polity of individuals with rights rather than shared goods, the state will have to grow powerful in order to adjudicate all of the different ways that the rights of individuals interfere with one another. It is also the case that in a liberal polity with no shared goods, the nation-state itself becomes the only good to which everyone is expected to adhere. The pluralism of ends or goods produced by the freedom to choose one's own good in a liberal polity becomes a problem. John Courtney Murray recognized this and appealed to the natural law tradition of reasoning to create a unum out of the pluribus. But even Murray admitted that such an American consensus was dead, and if it was dead in Murray's day, it's even deader today. In the absence of any rational consensus about shared goods, devotion to the nation-state itself becomes ever more urgent. Pluralism will always be a crisis for the liberal state, and the solution to the crisis of pluralism is to rally around the nation-state, the locus of a kind of mystical communion that rescues us from the conflicts of civil society. War and emphasis on state security more generally has a crucial role to play in fostering national unity. As the work of Paul Kahn, Carolyn Marvin, and others has demonstrated, war in liberal society operates as a kind of sacrificial system that binds the fates of disparate individuals to the security of the state. We're never more united than in war. And all of this, I think, goes a long way toward explaining the pathos of the bishops' campaign for religious liberty. While the bishops appealed to the principle of freedom of conscience, A faithful Catholic is fired for refusing to display the American flag. While the Fortnight for Freedom holds up the importance of religious liberty, not a word of protest is raised against torture, assassinations, surveillance, and other assaults on freedom by the security state. The Campaign for Religious Liberty has attempted to defend church institutions by appealing to liberal principles and American patriotism that can't help but erode them in the long run. The campaign is convinced that the best way to counteract the erosion of the church's freedom is to be itself, is to emphasize the tight fit between American ideals and the church. But this Constantinian habit of insisting that the church fits neatly into the social order only makes it more difficult to make peace with a post-Constantinian world. So what would it mean in practical terms for Catholics to think of ourselves as homeless in America, as on pilgrimage, as Augustine would have it, to our heavenly home? I think it would mean avoiding the oscillation between apocalyptic predictions of doom for Christian America on the one hand and strident patriotism on the other. Being a Catholic in America has its advantages and its disadvantages, but America never was a Christian country, and there are significant tensions between the American project and the gospel. Freedom to spread the gospel is an important goal, but rather than a campaign for freedom that primarily attempts to protect the church's position in society, why not a fortnight for freedom that says, we, the church, stand with all those victims of torture, discrimination, drone strikes, war, human trafficking, etc., for whom freedom is just an empty word. The church's action would be less self-referential, as Pope Francis has called us to be. Let me broaden the picture a bit. A church not fully at home in America would consider itself a somewhat foreign social body, not fully digestible into the ends of the nation state. We would make decisions about immigration and what wars to participate in based on gospel criteria rather than national interest. Imagine if significant numbers of Catholics had followed the Pope in 2003 and thinking that this was not a just war and we're not going to participate. It might furthermore help heal some of the divisions in the church, to recognize that Catholics should feel at home as neither Republicans nor Democrats, two corporate-sponsored parties, neither of which comes close to representing the vision that Catholic social teaching puts forward for a just and peaceful world. I don't think the sense of homelessness should sound so strange to Catholics, whose church belongs in all countries and belongs to none of them. We're the followers of a crucified God. As the letter to the Hebrews says, here we have no lasting city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. The messy church to which our Argentine Pope is calling us is one that finds its freedom not in the security of the nation state, but in following the Son of Man who had no place to lay his head. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. We'll continue the conversation afterwards, but you're invited to be part of it now, and we would like very much to have questions from the floor. I will call on people. Could you stand up and introduce yourself, and then Bill will respond. We'll go on for this as long as our host allows us to, after which point we will turn off the lights and send everybody home.
Thank you. Yeah, your statement that there isn't any difference between Catholics in terms of voting to the general populace, to me, indicates a total failure of the Catholic Church to incorporate the truth of the gospel within the congregants of the Catholic Church, and to relate that then to go forward into influencing society.
Is that just a statement, or would you like a response? Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I don't think the answer to that problem is that we just haven't chosen the right political party. I think that we should and can witness to the current parties as they are to be better than they are. But what I'm asking for, I think, is a greater sense of realism that what we're facing is a situation in which half of the people who are eligible to vote in America don't vote because they don't think it makes any difference, and they're at least partially right, that there's a tremendous sense of disaffection with the political process in the United States, and Catholics ought to feel that deeply because neither the Republican nor the Democratic Party represent anything like what Catholic social teaching is looking for in our as the ideal for our society. And so while I think participation in the political process is fine and admirable in many ways, I think we need to be more realistic about that. And I think we need to do more than think of our political presence as nothing more than whether or not I'm going to vote Republican or Democrat 4 years, once every 4 years. What I'd like to see is the church to become a presence in its own right, a burr in the system. And the example that I alluded to very briefly in the paper is one that's very dear to me. Instead of just voting for candidates who either will or won't support any given war, the idea that Catholics might sit a just war out, I think, would have tremendously radical consequences, and it's really nothing more than just adherence to the just war theory, which states that we fight just wars and we don't fight unjust wars, but it just never seems to work out that way. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming to that. I've got a loud voice anyway. My question for you, Bill, would be, what would you say to and about the NSA today, because of this, tremendous technical advance and the infusion of money has really transformed that intelligence agency? They'd say that they are protecting us from terrorists. What would you say to them?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I think the best way to protect us against terrorists would be to stop meddling in Muslim countries. I think there's a sort of narrative out there that we were sitting here minding our own business when suddenly these crazy people attacked us in September of 2001. And the terrorist attacks are obviously, I hope I don't even need to say this, but obviously abhorrent and wrong. But in order to understand why those attacks take place, we need a deeper analysis than simply there's crazy people out there who hate freedom and want to get us. And it has a lot to do with the history of the United States relationships with the Middle East. And a serious conversation would take that into account and begin to think about different ways of dealing with the world than simply trying to project our strength and our ideals upon the rest of the world by force if necessary. And so it seems to me that the best way to deal with terrorism would be to get to the root of terrorism, which has one of its causes, not the only cause, but one of its causes in the way the United States has projected its strength over the course of the 20th and into the 21st century. So Charles Tilly talked about the modern nation state as like the Godfather. It's a protection racket, that we're offered protection against enemies that the state made for us. And I think in certain ways that goes a long way to understanding what's going on. Why does somebody from halfway around the world want to come over here and blow me up? It's not because I love freedom and they hate freedom, but it has a lot to do with the enemies that were made for me on my behalf. And I think as Christians, we need to do better at loving our enemies. and wondering where they came from in the first place.
Hi. Do you think there's a better form of government than what America has, and what is that form of government?
Yeah, good question. I mean, what I'm raising questions about liberal principles. And in that way, I'm kind of standing in the tradition of Catholic thought that people like Alistair McIntyre, David Schindler, Patrick Deneen, people like that stand in, where rights need to be based on something other than simply the autonomy of individuals to choose whatever, as the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision put it, that every person is free to invent their own conception of the meaning of life and so on. And I think that a full conception of rights needs to be based on something thicker than that, for a lot of the reasons that I talked about in the paper. Democracy, on the other hand, so liberalism as a theory has problems, I think, from a Catholic point of view. Democracy, on the other hand, I think is probably the best we can do for a form of government in the current condition. The real question, I think, is what is democracy, and do we live in a democracy? And here I'm with people like Sheldon Wolin, who think that in order for democracy to function as it's meant to function, we really need to devolve into a less centralized form of government, where there's more. McIntyre is in the same ballpark, I think, when he says that there are certain limited goods that the nation state can protect, but a real politics needs to be small enough that people can make face-to-face decisions and have a certain sort of face-to-face discernment. And that's the kind of thing, what's sometimes called radical democracy, that I think is most consonant with something like the Catholic concept of subsidiarity. And these are the kinds of questions, I think. I mean, it used to just be you had a choice between democracy or communism, and that when communism, of course, was bad, and so it was that was your choice. But I think the where the conversation needs to go now is on asking the question, what would it mean to actually have a functioning democracy, and try to make that happen.
I just had another question. Do you think that Catholics can be politicians or statesmen?
Sure. I mean, clearly they are, for better and for worse. I'd like to see Catholics that were in interesting ways bringing their Catholicism to bear on the public order. But the way the political game is set up these days, I think that's difficult. Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think of the modern nation state as the weather. There's not, it's here, and this is what we have. But Christians have always, Cardinal George said something after he said his famous comment about how his successor is going to die in prison and his successor's successor will die a martyr. So very dire apocalyptic things. He said something right after that that's not often quoted, where he said, but something to I can't remember the exact words, but something to the effect of, Catholics have lived in all sorts of different social orders, and we'll get by. We'll pick up the pieces and we'll do the best we can. And that's the way that's the image of homelessness and the image of pilgrimage that we get, from the gospel and from Augustine. I think has that sense that every social order is something to be, to be dealt with as best we can on our way to our true home. Yeah.
Could you please identify yourselves, too? Thank you.
I'm Michael Blissenbach, and I'm a second-year law student. and I've got a couple questions. Do you think the current situation that we're in the United States was the result of a heresy called Americanism that was common in the 1800s in the U.S.? And the second question I have is, how would you suggest that Catholics respond to unjust laws like the H.H.S. mandate, unjust wars, and like the Arizona immigration law?
Yeah, Americanism was a heresy that was condemned by Pope Leo XIII in 1899, and it's a vague kind of a heresy, and one to which nobody actually claimed to be an adherent, as most often happens. But the general sense, I think, was a concern not just with assimilation to American society, but assimilation to American society in the particular sense of being favorable to more democratic forms of church organization. Pope Francis has called for the decentralization of the church. He actually used that term. And I think that's probably a positive move. But if what Americanism means is the kinds of things that I was critiquing in the paper, then clearly I think that we need to recognize more than we often do that there's a tension there. And the second part of your question was about how should we respond to
unjust laws like the H.H.S. mandate and the Arizona immigration law?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's an important principle at stake in the H.H.S. mandate, and the details of it we can get into. But the important principle, I think, is right, that Catholic institutions are not non-religious, even though they often act like they are. But we have a stake in protecting the freedom of Catholic institutions to not violate our own principles. What I'd like to see is an articulation of that in terms of group rights and not just individual rights. And for this, here I'm going to be getting into all kinds of speculative territory, but I think in terms of something like what Rowan Williams articulated and got all kinds of hell for, when he actually suggested that a space in English law be carved out for certain limited forms of Muslim Sharia law to have their own law. Probably a better analogy in the American context is American Indian law, which in some ways grants a certain sort of autonomy there. There's a fascinating book, research done by Tissa Wegner about the Pueblo Indians in the 1920s and how they approached religious freedom. The government was trying to shut down their traditional dances because they found that this was interfering with, they thought it was interfering with children's education, that it was interfering with the process of assimilation to American society. And even though the Pueblo Indians had no concept of religion in their vocabulary, because they didn't think there was a separate category of life called religion. I mean, it was just it was just life. It was just part of their life, and that's part of why I'm arguing that Catholics ought to think the same way in some ways. But they adopted the language of religious freedom in order to protect their dances. But then they found that people in the Pueblo tribe were invoking the concept of religious freedom to be able to refuse to participate in the dances. And so they found that they won themselves some limited protection by adopting this sort of foreign concept into their culture. But then it became a two-edged sword. And that's kind of what I'm arguing about this, that this whole concept of religious freedom is a two-edged sword that needs to be handled very carefully. And if we really want to, we're going to need to articulate a principle of group freedom in order to protect ourselves. Yeah.
Angela Sinander from the Theology Department. I know from your work that you've looked at this question in other contexts, and Pope Benedict wrote on religious liberty violations around the world, and I was wondering if you'd like to comment on that based on your other work between security state and religious liberty, religious freedom.
I'm not sure I understand the question. So, I mean, clearly, there's a deep concern. I mean, statistics have been cited that millions of Christians are kind of under siege and under threat of violence and being killed every year in all parts of the world. And Pope Benedict has responded to that.
Yeah, I guess I asked the question, having taught students from Vietnam, where it wouldn't be the same kind of liberal ideology that you're talking about that drives the experience, but you could look at some points of comparison, and depending on how you frame the interpretation of the case law here, one could look at worship, where it's communal, right, but limited to the group as being what's allowed. And for them, you could have that similar kind of experience, but the social dimension, how people are acting on it in public, beyond worship becomes an issue. And so I'm just curious what you could say to kind of a comparative other countries' approach to this.
Yeah, that's a really good question that I don't really know if I have a really good answer for. I think the way you've just articulated it is probably the best I could say at this point. I mean, a lot of it depends, of course. I mean, religious liberty is important just in the point of standing up and saying, look, people are being killed for this, and this needs to. People are being killed for being Christians. People are being killed for being Muslims, and this is something that we need to stand up and speak forcefully about. But how exactly you go about speaking for that, I suppose. I mean, it's probably best to take an approach like the Declaration on Religious Liberty, which doesn't base religious freedom just on the basis of freedom from interference, but bases religious freedom based on the idea of the dignity of the human person and the need for the human person to worship. And so there's a kind of anthropology of homo religiosus that's there that I think needs to kind of underlie a fuller approach to that. Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much, Bill. My name is Billy Junker. What about this? To talk about there being group rights necessarily means you might think to talk about those group rights being enforceable, because rights which are not enforceable are not rights in a real sense. But to talk about group rights as being enforceable is to say that when push comes to shove, there's the possibility of coercion there somewhere. Otherwise, you can't respect the group right. But in the context of the nation state, for a group right to be a real right, that is to say enforceable by the threat of coercion, ultimately speaking, there will be some kind of state entity behind the recognition of such a right. So I suppose I see a tension between the wanting to recognize group rights and your hesitancy of sort of embracing the coordination or union of church and state. I can understand wanting to posit group rights if you see the church as having some kind of role in the arm of the state. What's difficult for me to see how group rights works conceptually while maintaining the separation between church and state.
I guess, but I don't know why. I don't know why the church would have to be part of the governing apparatus in order to articulate a right to live up to its own principles without interference from the government.
Let's thank our presenter and continue the conversation in the lobby where there is coffee and maybe still some cookies left. I don't.
Thanks.